having survived the tumultuous changes that China has undergone over the past century. Many of Beijing's old neighborhood still stood firm during the early 1990s. It was a miracle that the Chinese capital's iconic narrow alleyways and courtyards had been left unscathed by wars, fires, and human interference. However, in recent years, the hutongs have been defenseless against the forces of modernization. As one by one, these ancient structures have been flattened to make way for high-rises, shopping malls, and widened avenues. In today's China View, we meet Michael Mayer, author of The Last Days of Old Beijing, who shares his views on urban planning and Beijing's cultural preservation.
And also, some people refer to hutong as a urban slum or urban corner.
Sure.
While in your book you quote a saying that and it's just a low-rent, stable area. It's actually unslumming.
Yeah.
So why is that?
I understand if you come from elsewhere and you look at that neighborhood, of course you would think it's a slum. But a slum is a neighborhood that causes pathological behavior, and I didn't see any evidence in my years in the hutong, in this neighborhood, that people were behaving poorly because of the environment. In fact, I found it being a sort of citizen incubator that people from outside Beijing could come there and live at low rent and start businesses. And I saw them over time really buying into and becoming Beijing citizens. You know, that when they first come, they have regional accents. Over time, they start speaking Beijing Hua. They start speaking the Beijing accent. They're proud their children are going to Beijing schools. They're proud to pay taxes. And then you saw another cycle. The new people would move in, you know, and then those people that were formerly outsiders would say, like, oh, well, I'll help you become a Beijing person. So, but I do understand if you don't know who each of these people are and their stories, why you would think, we really need to clean this up. This doesn't look very nice.
So you think instead of a slum, the hutong is mainly more like a melting pot?
I do think it's a melting pot. That's a good way of saying it. And you know, when you think about it, New York City has Queens, and San Francisco has the Mission, and London and these other big cities, Paris, they have these districts that allow outsiders to come in and bring their energy and their labor and their ideas to the city, and then over time they become you know, citizens in the truest sense of the word, citizens. And in Beijing, the question has often been, can the hutong serve an economic purpose? And if they take old houses and turn them into bars or art galleries, you can say, oh, well, there's a purpose. But there's another purpose I think we're not talking about enough or realizing, which is they're a melting pot that allow fresh blood to be pumped into Beijing and allow these people to buy into the system and what's happening here.
And there's a way of preservation in China that is to tear down the old buildings and replace them with new lookalikes.
Yeah.
And what do you think of this way of preservation?
It's you know, something that I think a lot of Western readers especially were surprised to see, but in Japan, in Korea, in China, in India, in Vietnam and Thailand, this was for hundreds of years the way buildings were preserved. And the reason was quite simple. In Europe, the most beautiful architecture is made of stone, whereas a Chinese building, a temple especially, or a courtyard home, because they're made out of wood, the walls are made out of straw and mud and pig's blood, in the case of my house. It's really impossible to keep them up over time. There is a tradition here, dating back hundreds of years, long before the hutong were being destroyed, of tearing down architecture and rebuilding it because of the materials used.
And also the design and the building materials in China has remained largely unchanged for 2,000 years. And it's really difficult for ordinary people to tell which era of history they belong to, unlike in the West. So, so in the end, we just label all these buildings as old, ancient. What do you think of it?
And in Beijing, you know, with the hutong, there was that feeling of these courtyards are unchanged, they're timeless. But the deeper I got into my research, and you know this just from walking around the lanes, you do see reflections of history. You do see that next to a courtyard home that's maybe 100 years old, you'll see a very simple brick structure that is obviously from the 1950s, you know, in that era of Beijing's history. And so I like that. There's a scene in the book where I'm walking down my street, Yangmeiju Xie Red bayberry and bamboo slanted street, right? And I'm noticing that, at first when I got there, I thought like, oh, it's an old street. It's a 100-year-old street. It's a 600-year-old street, whatever it's going to be. But as I walked and looked at every single building, I could see every era of modern Chinese history back to the Qing dynasty reflected in the buildings on that street. Right down to one of the courtyard homes, you had to walk from the street down to enter it. And then somebody explained to me, this is the original house standing from early Qing dynasty, because in the old days, the street was dirt, and they would just simply add more dirt on top of the street. And so the houses, after a while, the street would rise while the house stayed in the original position. So it was really fun. I felt like an archaeologist doing this book, looking at these different eras.
Some of the hutongs who have escaped being raised, they have been turned into like touristy places full of bars and guest houses.
Yeah.
So what role do you think tourism plays?
And I guess the question is, this is really difficult for every old city to balance, is what are you there for? Are you there, is the city the citizen city or is it a tourist city? And it's difficult to balance that. So cities like London have parts of their city aimed at tourists, like Covent Garden, for example. But they have other parts of their city there for the residents. And you go to Kyoto, for example, in Japan. That's a tourist city, but it's largely for its residents still. There's still a stable population there that has stayed. And that's the thing Beijing is facing right now. When you look at huge projects like Tianmen, where they've rebuilt the street in the ancient fashion, versus Wangfujing, versus Xidan, versus what's going on around the Drum and Bell Tower and the lakes, you have to look at, well, who is this aimed at? And is it bad if we go all toward attracting tourists? Maybe there should be parts of the city that are for tourists, and there should be parts of the city that residents live in. And a fact that often goes overlooked is that a lot of tourists want to see how average Beijing people live. They don't want to go to the lanes and find a bar. They don't want to see a reproduction, a sort of Xintiandi, to cite Shanghai's famous outdoor shopping mall. They want to see what's really unique to this city.
And do you think the value of preserving Beijing's hutong lies in protecting its community or its buildings?
That's a really good question. When I started the book, I thought I was writing about architecture. I thought I was writing about Beijing city planning. I learned rather quickly I was really writing about community. And I saw the value of the hutong was a living cultural heritage, right? That it's alive and it's being made use of by the community. And that's what I'd like to see preserved. It's very difficult to do. Very difficult to say, let's change the houses, but keep the residents. But that's where this all started in 1991. The original plan for the dilapidated renewal program was that the houses would be renewed, the community could stay. But we've gone far away from that track now.
China has some successful examples of preservation projects like the Old Town in Lijiang and in southwest Yunnan province. So what do you think is the key to a preservation
Sure,
project?
and in the book I visit Hanoi and Vietnam and Luang Prabang in Laos and also Lijiang and the people who are behind the preservation of those places, or at least the planners who are working on plans to preserve them. And one thing those places all shared in common was citizen participation, asking locals, what do you need? What do you want? Do you want to stay? If you do want to stay, how can your life be made better? If you need to, if we need to build something or allow things for you to make an income, let's talk about that. If you need better transportation, let's talk about that.
Do you think the city project in Beijing or in other Chinese cities should allow more public participation?
Oh, definitely, and not because just because it's smart planning. It's never a bad thing to ask people what they really need, because their answers might surprise you.
And also, I'm always wondering why the alleyways have survived the Cultural Revolution and other turmoils over the years, while many other Asian buildings were torn down.
People were living in them, and a lot of people were living in them. It wasn't like there was one family in one courtyard, and it would have been easy to march in and say, okay, we're going to start tearing this down. After 1955, really, this concept of a daza yuar, a big, messy courtyard, however you say it, right, that people were moved in because there was such an acute housing shortage here in Beijing.
So it's even more ironic to see those buildings get torn down after all this.
It's amazing when you look at global capitals, right? Most major ancient cities have experienced a catastrophic earthquake fire. Moscow's burned down 7 times over the centuries. War, being bombed. And so it's really incredible that until the 1990s, this relic, this living fossil, really, of ancient urban planning still existed. And that is what makes it so ironic, is that only now is it really being dismantled. But it's being dismantled for, I think, an obvious reason, too, which is money.